So this is great play for me. So let me begin. Um, Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to introduce Bruce Poulter, who is going to be an interviewer along with me of the marvelous Gunther Weil. Bruce is in the Boulder area. He is one of the main teachers and protagonists of MDMA's assisted psychotherapy programs, teaching countless numbers of people and providing a basis for new consciousness through his work. And we're very happy to have him. He is an old buddy of Gunther Weil's. Well, he's a young old buddy of Gunther Weil's because no one's as old as Gunther, including me. So as I was saying to Bob Thurman earlier today, there was a funny thing on NPR distinguishing between old codgers and old fogies. And what was the difference? Well, I guess you and I, Gunther, we're old codgers. We're not old fogies. We're old codgers. We're still at it. And Gunther Weil's been at it for a very long and honorable time. He stretches all the way back to Leary in 1960 and Harvard, and becoming an erstwhile student of Leary's, who he can tell us about because it's quite an extraordinary story, and did work in the prison psilocybin project, as he's unfortunately fond of saying. He is the last standing member of that tribe of four. And he went on to Milbrook and actually made a conscious and thoughtful decision to save himself and his new family from what was emerging in Milbrook. And he, let me get rid of that, and went on to develop himself in myriad ways. He's currently the founder and CEO of Value Mentors, which he can describe to us. And he's continued his work in marvelous ways as a people worker, looking at the nature of human connection and human possibility. Okay, let's begin our talk. Bruce, you want to start nailing him before I nail him?
So Gunther,
hey, Bruce.
So you had this incredibly rich experience back there with Dr. Leary. Like, how is that? Let's get to the quick. So how has that informed your life today? Like, what have you? We'll start there.
Well, it was, as you might imagine, deeply transformational. Meeting him, within the first couple of days of starting my graduate work at Harvard in 1960, and then having my first psychedelic experience like within the first 2 weeks of that with psilocybin. So, it was deeply transformational, and it led very directly to my interest in mind-body practices of all types, of various forms of meditation and spiritual work, to my interest in depth psychology. It led to a direct relationship with Abraham Maslow, who gave me my first teaching job at Brandeis, because he was working on what he called peak experiences at that point, and we were in the business of creating them on a daily or weekly basis, and he was studying them, so it was a logical fit. So he kind of drafted me, and that's where I got my first academic gig, in the midst of this kind of hasty exit from Harvard when everything fell apart. So I can trace my life and the transformational event, really, that first session, and obviously many subsequent sessions, going all the way back to 1960. What I've been doing professionally for many years now with coaching and consulting work is a direct, particularly with human values, which is my interest, in people's worldviews. In other words, the lenses through which they look at life. As I'm looking through these reading glasses, we all have these lenses, what we call worldviews, and we're generally not conscious of them. And one of the things we know from psychedelics is how it can actually undermine our current worldview and provide a whole different one. And this is very common. So that fundamental shift in worldview results in a shift of values. So again, I can see a direct connection going all the way back to 1960, in the fall of 1960, with that initial experience.
Yeah, so it was foundational to what you're doing right now, right? And
I
you were
believe
ahead of
so.
your time.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm gonna mute my mic because we got.
Gunther, just part of the fun of our overlap of lives, which we explored past, was I was at Brandeis the same year as my first year undergrad, and I was a student of Maslow's quite critically, and had a lot of experience with him, and subsequently with his family. So that's one of our many overlaps. But they're
Yes.
amusing when we found them. It was like a rich brotherhood emerging, and I'm still left with some of the wonderful feelings of that. So, yeah,
Yes,
Maslow. So, what happened with you and Leary? Tell us a bit more about what happened, and maybe the prison project and things of that sort.
Well, I think, it was very auspicious because we met in his office, which was a converted utility broom closet on the first floor of a colonial structure called the Center for Research and Personality on, you name it, Divinity Avenue in on the Harvard campus, right, in Cambridge. And so I was assigned to Tim, basically, through some kind of, depending on the perspective we're speaking from, either a kind of a random assignment, or obviously the cosmos had something to do with it. So we met, and he began to tell me about what had happened to him the summer before in Cuernavaca, which is a well-known story, where he ingested the mushrooms with the curandero there, and how that transformed his view of life, his professional interests, and so on. And how he wanted to dedicate the rest of his life, professionally and personally, to studying human consciousness. And would I be interested in that? And if not, then I should probably go work with somebody else. And of course, having heard that and given my own background, having been exposed, you used the phrase earlier, Kudgeman, right? Or what was the phrase you used?
Roger.
Codger, right?
Right.
So, I date back to the 50s. I'm part of the so-called Eisenhower silent generation, but I was turned on to the hipsters, basically. This was like pre-yippie, okay, pre-yuppie. This was the hipsters. This was San Francisco.
You were a McCarthy baby like me.
Yeah, basically, at that era.
Coming out of the war, yeah.
Yeah, and having been exposed to bebop and jazz and living in Paris for a year and so on and so forth, I was exposed early on to marijuana in my, I was 18, 19 years old, even earlier, 17. And so hanging out with jazz musicians in Milwaukee, where I grew up. So I had an early exposure. So I was kind of, primed to work with Tim. So when he said,
a question about that, because Tim has been so vilified, and I've always taken a position that that really was Nixonian, and while he got inflated and carried away, in some ways, his value to all of us and to the movement, with all his flaws and his betrayals and all the rest, that there was an immense quality to his personality and intellect. So you meet him in 1960. Does he seem inflated to you as he tells you,
no, not at all.
You go elsewhere? How did he seem to you?
Not at all. He was always, charming, bright, funny, very engaging, right, looking you right in the eye, very, very present. And as I said a moment ago, very charming and fun. And just to give you an example of his level of brilliance, in our first session at his rented home in Newton, Massachusetts, he was quoting from Finnegan's Wake. He was quoting passages from Finnegan. I mean, I tried reading Joyce. I couldn't make head or tail of it, and he had absorbed it. He was speaking in character, basically, It's amazing.
That could be sign of insanity, though. That could be a little bit out there.
You know,
Depending
hence
on your
brilliance, right?
perspective.
I mean, he was brilliant. So there you go.
Yeah, absolutely. And fun. And at the same time, the tendencies of kind of, you know, in your face, anti-authoritarian. I mean, Tim couldn't handle authority in any form, left, right, or center. I mean, the famous story of him being on the lam, having been strung from Vacaville or whatever it was by the weathermen, and living in Algeria as Eldridge's Cleaver's house guest, being part of a larger conspiratorial arrangement with the Algerian socialist government at that time, with its anti-American propaganda, using Eldridge Cleaver as a foil in that whole, you know, narrative, and then adding Timothy Leary to the mix. Of course, Tim was, you know, so irascible and so impossible that he was making Eldridge's life difficult. And so Eldridge had to kind of lock him up, so to speak, had keep him on a short leash so he wouldn't embarrass him or the Algerian government.
Well, but Eldridge was a pretty mixed bag. I mean, the things that he did later, we heard from Kathleen, his wife, some of the atrocities he performed. I knew him. I knew Max Geismar, his editor, you know, for Soul on Ice. And, you know, Eldridge was not himself a simple character. He got kicked out of Cuba. He also, you know.
Sure, but I get it. And I'm aware of some of those stories. But, you know, can you imagine Tim being in this Algerian lair with Cleaver, and they're trying to navigate, you know, Cleaver's trying to navigate the Algerian government and the whole thing. And Tim is like a pain in the ass, you know? So Cleaver, right? So Tim wrote about this in his little book, which is not as well known, called Confessions of a Hope Fiend, where he describes, you know, elements of that.
So you go on with Tim, and you begin working with him, and some of that work is really, really fascinating and historic. So tell us a little bit.
So probably, you know, the showcase, so to speak, or poster child, if you will, project was the Prison Project. Although there are many others, you know, and people coming through like Huxley, like Alan Watts, Charlie Mingus, on and on, Dizzy Gillespie, on and on and on. Arthur Kessler. I mean, I could give you a, like, you know, what's the psychiatrist who I actually got to know and meet? Ronnie Lang, actually. You know, I've spent a few days with Ronnie, picked him up at the airport at Kennedy Airport, drove him up to Milbrook. But yeah, the Prison Project was, you know, it's where things came together, and we were so ahead of our time. I mean, I think about it now. I think about, you know, how almost ridiculous it is. Here we are, like, negotiating with the Massachusetts correctional system through the Department of Mental Health and the, you know, whatever aspect of the penal system. I've forgotten the exact name of the, you know, of the group, and we were Harvard, you know, here are Harvard PhDs doing an experimental project using pharmaceuticals, which at that time you could do basically if prisoners volunteered for pharmacological or pharmaceutical trials, they would get good time. They would get time off their sentence. So from the standpoint of the Department of Mental Health and Corrections, we were just like a Harvard group, although we weren't the Harvard Medical School, Harvard group of psychologists coming in to administer a drug to see if that could lower the recidivism rate, which was around 72, 73%. Historically, Phil, I don't think it's changed at all over all these years. You know? So, but we were seeing if through that intervention, psychedelic intervention, we could have an effect. So here we are at 8 o'clock in the morning. We're walking through this Gothic prison, Concord prison, which was 100 years old back then. And, you know, before all the electronic gates and everything, these heavy iron doors, it was like a scene out of a Gothic Frankenstein movie, you know. And we walk across the yard into the hospital wing at the very back of the rotunda, and they lock us in with about 12 inmates. who we had pre-selected based on the fact they would have release dates so that we could track the recidivism rate. And so they were volunteered, but then they were screened on a few criteria, and half got psilocybin and half got a placebo. And for the next 6-7 hours, there we were with all these inmates laying on cots or walking around. We brought in a few Indian prints in order to create a semblance of setting. We even tried to use some incense, but that got, kind of denied very quickly. Nobody really knew what we were doing. Everyone was kind of mystified, including ourselves. But, we launched, and there were some extraordinary experiences that happened, interactions. I have a lot of stories, actually direct stories, things that happened to me and to I would call them our colleagues, so-called research subjects who, in terms of Tim's kind of game theory model of human behavior, which he was developing at that time, we very quickly.
Why don't you give us a story? Give us a little taste of one of these, if you don't mind.
Okay, so there was an inmate there who had been in prison pretty much for his whole life. Irish mafia, extortionist, who knows, you name it. And his brother was on death row in Walpole. So he came from an Irish mafia crime family. And he had taken psilocybin. I'm sitting at the edge of his bed or on a stool, on a chair, and trying to support him as a guide, which we were training ourselves to do. And he was just unresponsive. I mean, he was really almost catatonic, stiff. Physically, he wouldn't look at me. His eyes were looking straight ahead. There was, it was like really strange. And I was doing everything I possibly could as a young aspiring therapist, right? Over my head, but doing my best to try to support him. And I couldn't get anywhere with it. So that went on for hours and hours. And finally, I just kind of, let it go. And then we left. 2 weeks later, we came back because we would alternate the sessions with debriefs. Okay? So at that point, he met me. He was cheery. He was fine, communicative. And we were speaking. And I said, Jim, what was going on last, 2 weeks ago? He said, well, he said, I got into a state where I believed that this was a truth serum you guys were administering, and that you were trying to nail me for all the crimes that I committed I never got busted for, and I was planning to have you killed. So we had a chuckle about that, and if you can believe it, and we went on our way. So that was one story. Okay.
It was an outcome study, wasn't there, of sorts?
There was,
it was criticized badly, but there was an outcome story. Do you remember the details?
I don't remember the details, but I remember Ralph and I worked on a paper.
Yeah.
And Rick Doblin, of MAPS fame, was a graduate student who wrote his master's or PhD thesis on that project.
That's right.
And then he was tracking things. And then a few years later, he convened a meeting at Tim's house in Beverly Hills, up in the mountain, in Beverly Hills, not far up the road from the Beverly Hilton, if you will. And there were about 6 or 7 of the inmates there who had been released and had stayed out of prison, and myself and Ralph Metzner and Tim. And so we were together for 2 days, kind of celebrating and sharing stories. And Rick was there actually to attend that.
I wrote about it. I forgot. Yeah.
Yeah. So what we discovered, from a research perspective, was that we really didn't impact the recidivism rate, or if we did, it was so small it wasn't really, quote unquote, statistically significant. And what we realized at the time, and I think it's being re-realized now by many people, including yourselves, you guys, is the need for methods of integration of that experience into one's daily life. And particularly if you're a criminal and you've spent a lot of years behind bars, you're not socialized to interact with normal people. You're excluded. The job opportunities are very scarce. So cons end up hanging out with other cons. And there's a famous sociologist of that period who coined a fancy phrase called differential association theory, which translates basically that people hang together, of like stripes, basically, or cast together by virtue of their situation, their life conditioning and situation. So it's a self-reinforcing prophecy. So Tim identified early on through his game theory model that prison was like a graduate school for learning crime. So the older inmates would be teaching the younger inmates. So it was essentially like, an advanced curriculum in learning how to become a better criminal.
For a while, I worked on the prison unit at Bellevue Hospital during med school in the mid-'60s. And there were a lot of dips there, people who were very skillful about picking pockets. And there was kind of an internal exchange of how best to pick pockets going on the ward, improve technique. I got a little instruction, but it was just like that. How did you do things better?
Yes. So when you intervene in a system like that, through a powerful transformational experience that opens the doors of perception, to quote Huxley, and you create the seed for transformation, then you need follow-up mechanisms. And so we actually developed a relationship with Chuck Diederich, who was the founder of Synanon, who himself had taken LSD to heal his own alcoholism or drug addiction, I've forgotten which. And Synanon Synanon was focused on drug addiction, basically. And we met with Chuck a few times, and we decided to work together to create a 12-step type program, a Synanon type program for our inmates who would then be being released in various periodic cycles, So, but we were so far ahead of the game that we couldn't raise money for it. Nobody even understood what we were trying to communicate or do. So
transition us a little bit out of jail and into the Milbrook kind of frenzy.
Okay, so
can I pause you for a second there, Gunther? Because there's a really good story. Because one of the things that was different about your work is that you guys were taking the psilocybin as well. Yeah. You have this great experience of you having a very difficult experience and the inmates sitting for you.
Yes. Yeah. Let me share that story before I move on, because this is the kind of the second story that I often tell. And there are others, but at one point I had taken psilocybin and I found myself sitting, on like kind of in a yoga position on a bed, on a cot, because we had a number of cots around the room. And I began speaking to the group, with the assemblage, including Tim and Ralph and the inmates. And I was preaching, and I got into a kind of psychedelic evangelical mindset in which I was communicating very intense, and very congruent and coherent. And it was like really fired up. And at one point, I had an experience of the witness observing Gunther doing that shtick. And it was like, wow, look at that. And then the next thing that happened is I freaked out. I had an immediate emotional reaction that had to do with the power that I was exerting. I saw myself, I had a vision at that moment, I can see it clearly now, being like a black widow spider at the center of a web that I had created. And all these people were like caught in my web. And I freaked out, because I'm not a power broker. So I freaked out at my own authority, so to speak, or power. And I went into a swoon. I fainted. The next thing I know, I'm laying on a cot and I'm looking up, and I can see it through my own eyes now as we're speaking. I'm looking up at a sea of faces who are all kind of hunkered over, looking down at me with varying degrees of concern on their face and about my well-being. And I'm suddenly being like the, you know, the client for the inmates, right? Meanwhile, Tim is laughing and Ralph is, you know, kind of mystified by the whole thing. And I'm feeling a lot of love and charity and concern coming from these guys, you know, who I had nothing to do with in terms of normal, like, you know, conditions of strata of society or anything like that, you know. I'm a nice Jewish boy, grew up in a Jewish academic Holocaust family, basically, you know. My father, God bless him, couldn't change a light bulb. And I'm basically here, like, now suddenly, you know, seeking their help, basically, you know. It was very wild, very humbling also,
Great
and
story.
life-changing, you know, as you can imagine, you know.
Great story.
Yeah, and it's so important to that, you know, which was the dilemma with research at that time. You know, obviously we know all the stories, but to have it be where there's that reciprocity between so-called Harvard researcher and, you know, inmate in prison for crimes that are, you know, are difficult for lots of us. And so
Yeah.
it's just such an important flip.
And because we were meeting at the level of humanity, at a
Yeah.
deep level of humanity infused by spirit, it
Yeah.
was like, you know, it was a level of the personality, but it was infused by spirit, basically. And we were meeting and joining at that level as people, not as
Yeah.
doctors, professors, inmates. We were meeting at such a substratum of humanity. It was remarkable.
Yeah, that was a huge gift for everybody in that arena,
Yeah.
it sounds like.
It's a great teaching for us all, isn't
Yeah.
it, in terms of prejudice and working with prejudice.
And
Not to
hierarchy
be-
and, you know, hierarchy and status, all the stuff we sort for, you know, roles, for example, the role of psychologist and what that, or therapist or psychiatrist, right? What that gives us, for example, or being a PhD, for example, what that gives us in this society. You know, whether a coach, a teacher, a spiritual teacher, the roles dictate a certain amount of power, basically. And
Right.
then the status, for example, whether it's age or wealth or IQ or all these substitutes for real personal power.
It also speaks to what Thurman and I were talking about this morning, which was about, you know, a bit about Buddha nature, that ineffable quality that there is in almost everyone, not all, because we see too many people who don't have it. A sense of inner caring, of inner justice, of a sense of balance of what's right and wrong, and of compassion. As the Dalai Lama says, the great energy of the world is compassion, and not nuclear energy, it's compassion.
Yes.
So, you know, it doesn't exist in everyone that we can pull it out or anticipate it, but it does exist, and it's an important story about that.
Yeah, and again, the right, you know, I'm kind of playing here almost as a metaphor, but the right set and setting, you know, who knows what might emerge, right?
Yeah.
Okay, we're
Well,
going
and that's what we're seeing with our studies, you know, with MDMA and PTSD, which is the expert is actually the what we refer to as the participant, and how important that is, in addition to the authority that we have as the researcher and the provider and blah 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 blah. But the juice and the beauty is when you really hang out at that level, that essential level of human connection.
Yeah.
And that's such a revolution in psychotherapy with assisted psychotherapy, MDMA, ketamine, psilocybin, that we are real people and we're not invisible and we're not hiding behind a chair, you know, like on a chair behind a person. That we have to be real. We don't have to take advantage of people, but we need to show who we are and exhibit our commonality. So
yeah, exactly, our humanity. And I think, you know, if there's nothing else that came from that era, it was that insight. You know, it was really powerful, really important, and going back to your first question, Bruce, that was transforming. It's affected how to this day, how I interact with clients and people in general.
So
Yeah.
it's the story also of the envelope of psychedelic experience. It's not just the experience itself, but it's the envelope, the ambiance, the environment, the culture, the setting in which it occurs as we try and build nests for people. And you're in a terrible place. It's not a nest. People are stuck. They can't quite get out of it. Even with a great psychedelic experience, they can encounter themselves, but then they have to encounter the horror of their environment again.
Yes.
Takes away the experience in many ways. It may
Yes. Or reinforces the trauma.
Right.
Constantly, the trauma is being reinforced, through external circumstances, and sometimes continuing internal patterns, that can be seen through and in the best sense of the word, witnessed impartially in the middle of the session. But those patterns are so deeply ingrained in the nervous system that, and those neuronal pathways are so well established, they often will come back. That's why I'm a firm believer in the need for ongoing trauma work, or work of some type,
Well, you've been a firm believer in being in the spiritual nature of your being, and in Sangha and community as well. Behind you is a picture of Gurdjieff. We know that you and I have both been in the Namkhai Norbu Sangha for periods of time, that there's a holism to your view of psychedelics, that it's embedded within a framework of spiritual, emotional, interpersonal exploration, right?
Absolutely. I believed for many years, going again back to those early days, that the psychedelics were like a portal to presence. They were a portal, an opportunity to really grok at a deep level of one's being, the possibilities of human consciousness. But then you got to do the work.
Yeah, so that's right. That's where then the integration happens.
Yeah.
Still leveraging those access points that psychedelics create.
Yeah.
To then integrate those into the everyday life.
Yeah. Actually, the connection to my spiritual work began early at that time. Ralph Metzler, in particular, had gone to New York, because when he was living in Milbrook, he would go into Manhattan and study with a teacher of the Gurdjieff work there. His name was Willem Nyland, who's on my wall here, who became my teacher. So Ralph introduced me to the Gurdjieff work, gave me a copy of Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous. And then I attended, I actually heard that Mr. Nyland, the teacher's name, had a group in Boston where I was living, and he would come up once a month to do evenings. So I attended an evening there, and then I started doing that work with the Gurdjieff work and the Gurdjieff group in Boston and New York. And so I actually introduced him to Mr. Nyland, who was very interested in what we were doing, but was very cautionary. And I remember that meeting with Tim and Mr. Nyland, where I could see how Mr. Nyland was he was intrigued by Tim, and he appreciated his gifts. At the same time, he raised direct concerns of him about what Tim was doing and how he was doing it. And he said, what he said to him, and I'm paraphrasing now, what you're doing is really important, Tim. It needs to be structured. It needs to be protected. It's very powerful work, but the way you're going about it, you're basically drawing the ire of society on you. You need to change the way you're doing this. And of course, Tim wouldn't listen to that. Again, he was very headstrong, and again, anti-authoritarian. And he was already, pretty deeply in his way of working. So nothing came of that. But Mr. Nyland,
as I recall your story, you also became sensitive to that risk, and that was one motivation for leaving Milbrook. Maybe we could to that a bit.
Yeah, I actually, I mentioned earlier, I was, offered a teaching position by Abe Maslow at Brandeis. I taught there for a year. I had a 3-year contract, and I ended up quitting my job to go live in upstate New York at Milbrook with Tim and Dick Ramdas and Ralph and so on. And Abe was like, you know, really unhappy because he had expended a lot of political capital on my behalf. But, you know, and my parents were very unhappy. Being a nice Jewish boy from Milwaukee, you know, getting his first job with Abraham Maslow at, you know, major university, they were like unhappy about that. So anyway, you know, I went to Milbrook and entered into the fray there in that summer. I was prepared to live there indefinitely. And I had a dream one night that I was in a cosmic lead-lined cosmic ray chamber with a gigantic, you know, flywheel in front of me, like a ship's wheel, like on a sailing boat, you know, sailboat. And there was a big gauge in front of me in this console. And my job was, in this dream, was to open the wheel to let in the cosmic radiation and redline it, okay, to bring it up to the red line and hold it at the red line and not go over the red line in which I would be destroyed by the cosmic radiation, but to maximize the radiation without going into danger at that point. So as I'm having this dream, I am lucid. Like it's a lucid dream, and it's not like a Jungian kind of dream where you have to kind of interpret the symbolism afterwards. This was so self-evident. It was so like amazingly self-evident that what I was doing with my life right at that point was basically, you know, exposing myself to the cosmic radiation and kind of, you know, in the best sense of, redlining the, you know, dangerous sports. I forgot the phrase they use, you know, for that, you know, where you're going to the danger zone to get the adrenaline rush or whatever it is you're doing. At the end of the day, what you're actually doing by that kind of extreme sports, the word I was looking for, is you're looking to find a way to stay in the moment, to get free of your mind, right? So that's what I was doing. And I realized that, you know, I had my son and daughter were like 4 years old and 2 years old. And by the way, Milbrook was not a good community to raise children in at all. My wife was not happy about that, nor did I realize that before we went there. So we left basically. So I was there for the summer, not even the full summer. And I drove back to Boston, and I had to get a job because I had left my Brandeis gig. So I had to I found a research position, and so I could make a living and raise my family and start my life again. So that was the beginning of the whole next chapter that had to do with working as a consultant, as a coach, and I had a couple of other academic positions that went on for quite a few years. But my spiritual life, my inner life was really, as I was saying earlier, when Ralph introduced me to In Search of the Miraculous and I met Willem Nyland, that was the beginning of my interest in consciousness. And then when Nyland died, after about 10 years, 12 years of work with that group, I started exploring Taoism and Buddhism, and I ended up doing some workshops with Trungpa Rinpoche, and then quite a few years later became aware of Trungpa, of Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche and his work. I worked with him for a few years. And then explorations in Taoism with Mantak Chia and other teachers in terms of the Taoist alchemy practices interested me very much, and their relationship to Vajrayana practices and tantric practices and aspects of Dzogchen practices. So, and that interest and lifestyle, so to speak, has continued to stay as we speak now. So,
because you're a Tai Chi practitioner. So
yes, I have been.
Okay.
That was early on in my 30s. I played around with karate, Okinawan karate, and taekwondo, and aikido. And I was 31, 32, and I just found that particularly aikido, I just couldn't do the break falls. I mean, they were just, my body just couldn't handle it. And I discovered Tai Chi, and I fell in love with Tai Chi and have continued to practice now over 50 years. And I also teach it. We have a school here in Boulder. I'm an instructor, and I love Qigong and Tai Chi. It's been very, very sustaining and really supportive of my health and well-being for many, many years. I'll be 84 this January.
Bravo. Congratulations. January what? So we put it on the calendar.
23rd.
Okay. We have a party. So continuing this discussion about psychedelic issues, how if any, have psychedelics played a role in your continued growth and development of life?
Well, there were many years, Phil, where I was just kind of, living a different life, if you will, or I was away from it. I mean, I did maintain a connection with Tim, saw him a number of times. I maintained a connection with Richard Ramdas up to the time of his death, just even as a period of about a month before he died last year in Maui. We would frequently go visit Maui and hang out with him. So, I got interested about 3 years ago as I'm seeing this renaissance developing. I said, okay, let me check this out. So I had the opportunity to do a MDMA session with a guide, which I found really, really interesting. And I wanted to work with a guide because I hadn't myself done it in many years. And I figured, well, maybe there's a different state of the art now, or I thought it would be prudent to work with a guide the first time. Although Tim always he said to Ellen, my wife, at one point when I introduced her years ago, one of the first things he said to Ellen, he looked her in the eye and he looked at me, and he looked at her, and he said, Gunther's a good navigator. So it turned out that I actually was a pretty good navigator in the MDMA session. And that led to some interest in doing a few more MDMA sessions to clean up some residual trauma from Nazi Germany. Because I came over when I was 2 years old, and there was a lot of trauma from, I was born in 1937, so my parents were in the middle of that. That's a whole other set of stories. And with this whole Trump administration, what's been happening in this country in the last 4 years, some of that stuff has been re-triggered, as I'm seeing, I'm seeing reminders of the Weimar Republic and the inability to govern and the rise of Hitler and, and the economic crisis and the pandemic and the level of fear and blah, 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 okay, stuff we all know. And I'm seeing how easily, a significant percentage of the American population is falling into this classic fascistic strong leader, at any price. So it's been triggering some stuff for me. So I've been experimenting with the psychedelics again on a very limited basis and entirely by myself. I sit in this chair with eye shades for 6 or 7 hours. I've got some music program, which I turn on and off. And Ellen comes in occasionally to give me a glass of water and check if I'm okay, or if I have anything to dictate, so to speak, she'll write something down. So I've been exploring again, and I'm interested in some further exploration, particularly in the area of right now of creativity, and also, given my age, I'm interested in some aspect that have to do with preparing for death, actually, which is something that I'm working on myself right now. Not in any morbid sense at all. No, nothing negative about it at all. So
that's important at any age.
Yeah,
I am too. I am
yes,
too.
I am as well.
At 76, I don't take any of it for granted, and
yeah.
and doing the impermanence practice is always
Yes.
helpful in practicing it in myriad ways.
Yeah.
So 1 or 2 more questions. You've been
Sure.
so generous with us. So if you look back at the influence of psychedelics on meditation, our subject, What do you feel the interaction is between psychedelic experience and your meditative practices, if any?
Well, it depends on a number of things. It depends on what your intention or set is going into the session. It depends on dosage, and it depends on the type of substance also. So for example, with DMT, that is a completely different, from my perspective, a completely different outcome. Okay, that is basically the kind of dissolving or temporary extinguishing of the ego structure, not just the loosening of it, not just kind of like making it more flexible or more porous or more permeable. It actually suspends it. Okay?
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, so that is a different kind of outcome than, let's say, psilocybin, which has elements of ego permeability, a very strong aesthetic sense. In a more recent session, for example, the first time I had taken psilocybin since the 60s or 70s, I took a normal dose, and within a half hour I was starting to experience all kinds of visual effects again, the kind of kaleidoscopic stuff. And something in me said, okay, been there, done that. What else you got to show me? So,
I know the feeling. But how about with MDMA? So there's been some opening, a different kind of experience. Teach us about that experience.
MDMA has been a love fest of of a loving embrace of consciousness turning towards its wounded aspects, and or its consciousness speaking to its wounded aspect, if I could speak that way, its manifestation at a relative level that is wounded through trauma, what have you, and doing that in a way that is so loving, so embracing, such a manifestation of unconditional love for the subject that the trauma dissolves in that field of love. It can't sustain. It's like an ice cube melting in the sun, basically. That's the experience I had with MDMA, the two experiences I've had.
And you're working within your own childhood of the Holocaust, and of course being a survivor's child of the Holocaust, and how does that affect that experience in you?
Well, it's an interesting question. Still working that out. It's given me an ability to depersonalize that and experience it at the archetype level, so that I have there's an emotional resonance at the archetype level, but it doesn't collapse into the personal me.
That's a wonderful answer.
Yeah.
So that's how it would, yeah.
That's a precious sharing. Bruce, you have any more?
Boy, these are poignant moments. Gunther, thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, I love hearing all the stories. So, if you wanted to branch off into a story, that'd be great. Your descriptions of your experiences with MDMA have been really spot on. It's the basis of why we do this work. To connect that to that authentic self, in addition to all those things that have happened.
Yeah.
And to hold them simultaneously. Like, we're not trying to get rid of anything. We're trying to actually make use of.
Yeah, I would say this, just to refine that point a little more. And there is work to be done with the mind that has to do with the decoupling of associations, the automatic stimulus response. It's creating, the love energy creates the space in which this can happen, but there is actually cognitive work that needs to be done. It's part of that.
Isn't it kind of parts work in a way, in that, you know, the stream of grief and torment doesn't end. It doesn't disappear. It doesn't go underground. But the way in which you see the world in the moment can change from that part, seeing the world, which we do see the world from that vantage point, to a more liberated vantage point that allows us to be more here and now and responsive, and less in an attitudinal format that imposes that on what we're doing and seeing and being in this moment. That's how I see the.
I would agree with that perspective, and I would again caution, and this is based on my own experience, that it's a finely tuned distinction, because there's a way that going into the impersonal can be a form of bypassing.
Exactly.
Of course.
And
exactly.
so,
And there is roots and legacy. For instance, one of my little quirks is I hate when there are bad Jews. I hate the Epsteins. I hate how they ruin our tribe. And I ruin the quality of our being. So I still have that root part of me that says, get the hell out of here. You don't belong, you know?
Yeah.
And I see the world that way, as well as seeing who they are and how they got there.
Yeah. And again, given your Buddhist perspective, you see how all of this is like a play of consciousness anyway, right? With various realms, heaven and hell realms, and all of this is occurring within the embrace of Mara, right? And there are a couple of guidelines for kind of, you know, moving out of the illusions, delusions, attachments, fixations. But it's tricky work, and it's a lifetime's work. It keeps going on. Probably goes on beyond this lifetime, you know. Probably goes on at other realms that are not embodied.
Well, I think of the cultural stream, and that what we're doing right now is we're putting a little implementation in the cultural stream, hopefully in a good way. There are bad ways entering the cultural stream as well, but that's what we can do. We can move the cultural stream into a more loving channel. That's all it can do.
And that, you know, that's clearly our calling, all the three of us and many people, right? And we're each doing it in a way that is in our unique voice, you know, in a way. So, and holding that lightly too. So
Gunther, what would you, how would you impart to therapists today doing this work? Like, what would be what's important from, you know, like all this vast experience?
I would say, you know, there's a kind of beginning note in the octave around the wounded healer, wounded shaman, right? But it's critical that we do the work ourselves before, during, and after we're working with other people, because there are other deeper levels that, you know, that the buckets, one of my teachers once said, the buckets get heavier, the more conscious you are. You know, you're dealing with.
That's really good news for our listeners.
But you keep going, you know, because when I say the buckets get heavier, is, you know, the issues get deeper.
Yeah.
Even when they're resolved, a lot of them are resolved on the personal level. Then there's the whole archetypal level of, you know, being trapped in those potential bardos, you know, and so there's just it keeps on going, and that's the beauty of it.
Well, as a Zoten practitioner, you know, we're practicing trying to leave attachments as much as possible so that we can be in liberated space, provide that to ourselves and others, and that, I think that's a lot of the work of all of this, including the psychedelic aspect.
Yeah, actually, now that you're saying that, what just came up for me was one of the interesting things I'm noticing with psilocybin, and this has a lot to do with a lot of years of meditation and self-observation, self-remembering practice, is it creates an interesting space to see the arising of desire, early stages of the arising of attachment.
Yeah.
As the thoughts are just starting to mobilize, and how they begin to trigger like the emotional reactions. But there's always in my experience, always a thought that precedes the emotion. And a lot of times it's unconscious or preconscious. And before you know it, you're in a full-blown, attachment, right? And then there's always the possibility, depending on the work you do, to observe that and dissolve that. But what I'm finding with psilocybin is it's opening up a space of really seeing the first glimmers of consciousness forming desire and attachment.
Well, you haven't done ketamine yet, right?
I did ketamine many years ago in New York in circumstances that were not good. I didn't have a good experience, and I don't blame it on ketamine. It was the situation itself was a group thing. And anyway, but I'm interested. So.
Good. We're interested in helping you find your interest realized. So we do have to stop. Bruce, you want to have the last word?
Let's see. So, good question. So we asked you about therapists. So, yeah, open-ended. What have psychedelics taught you? I know we've been talking all around it. So what would you say, what's been your fundamental learning here? Because you've been in it and then you were out and then you now you're back in it in a different way.
Yeah. What have psychedelics taught me? It's one of many teachings, okay, that helped me live my life, and one of a number of teachings, and if I had a shrine room, and I had an altar, I'd put, a bottle of Sandoz's psilocybin, and in a sugar cube.
You never went to Sasha's lab, did you?
No, I never did.
Sasha's lab was jam-packed with every molecule in bottles, rusting beams, and all kinds of things. So it was like just a festival.
Yeah.
It was just an amazing kind of memorialization of all these psychic possibilities. It was quite something, and you sound like you have a lot of them in you. And I want to thank you for today, and blessings. We'll show this on the next week's program. You'll get a program and the rest. Hope you'll join us in theinfiniteplaya.com, and you and I will talk some more.
Okay. God bless you guys. Thank you so much. I love doing these.
Bruce.
They're always a lot of fun. And your questions are great. So it's very interactive. I love it. So thank you.
Yeah, much love, Gunther.
Much love. Okay,
much love,
take
Phil.
care.
Thank you.